Okay, so hi. I know that I haven't been, how can I put this, very chatty lately, and I apologize. I wanted to give you all last week to sort of get established in doing your online courses because I know that most of you are not used to doing courses online and that you've probably got an overwhelming amount of reading and writing to do now, that you're not attending lectures. So last week, all I wanted you to do was just review chapter 6, start looking at chapter 7. And I know I promised I wasn't going to do lecture videos, and I really don't want to do lecture videos, but what I do want to do is I want to give you an overview of the really important parts of these two chapters before we move on this week to deontology. So what we've been looking at in chapter 6 and 7 are consequentialist ethics, right? So let's just do a quick review of what that means. So remember, when we're looking at moral theories, what we're interested in is we're interested in assigning rightness or wrongness. Okay, so these are properties. We're interested in assigning the property of right, or moral wrong to particular actions, right? And so consequentialism and deontology are moral theories that are really going to focus on moral action. But if you know from just common sense psychology, action is sort of wrapped up in a set of other things. First of all, you've got a mental state, right, in your mind. You've got some sort of a mental state that's going to cause an action, and that action is going to cause consequences. So when we're looking at a moral theory, we could be interested in what is the mental state that gives rise to an action, or we can look at what are the consequences that arise from an action. And we can assign moral rightness or wrongness to an action based on either of these two things, right? So it's the manner in which the action is created or the effects of those actions. Now, if you remember, consequentialism is just sort of a broad category. And it's a category of theories that focus on the consequences of actions. So we're going to assign the property of moral right or wrong based on the consequences of those actions. And there are a number of different ways that you can do this. As we saw prior to our taking a hiatus, there are lots of different ways to sort of flesh out the specifics of these kinds of theories. Now we're going to just look, what we have been looking at is just a minor set of these kinds of theories. And the first one that we looked at is act consequentialism. Specifically, we looked at Mill's utilitarianism, okay? So one of the things that you need to do, the first thing you need to do, if you're going to be a consequentialist, is you have to figure out how you define those consequences. This should all be reviewed, by the way. So how are you going to define those consequences? Well, generally we think of them in terms of good and bad, or harm and benefit. Your book uses an economic term for this called utility or disutility. These are all in the same sort of category of things. It's really a way of talking about positive and negative. Okay, so what Mill says is he said, look, we're looking at what benefits human beings. That's what matters when you're looking at the morality of a situation, right? Was an action the right action to perform, or was it the wrong action to perform? Well, the best way to do that is to look at how it benefits people or how it doesn't benefit people, right? What benefits people, according to Mill? Happiness, right? Happiness is what matters to all of us. And that's what we should be really focusing on. Does an action produce a maximal amount of happiness for the greatest number of people? Well, that seems pretty straightforward, but what's happiness, right? I mean, think about it. It's possible, it's entirely possible that, that golfing makes some people happy and it doesn't make other people happy. Or how about kinky sex? Some people really like it, makes them very happy, and other people not so much, makes them uncomfortable. They're kind of like, right? And what's kinky sex? That itself is something that's really hard to define. So, I mean, does Captain America's having an affair with Donald Trump Jr. And doing the sexy lingerie exchange, does that make them happy? Would it make you happy? All right, so there seems to be a wide range of things that people think make them happy, and sometimes we can be wrong about that, right? So we can think that something like smoking crack makes you feel good. Is that happiness? Well, I don't know. Maybe we need a little bit better definition of what happiness is. So what Mill does is he says, well, I still want to keep it really simple, And the simplest way to do that is to define happiness in terms of pleasure, because we all experience states of pleasure. And so he says, look, anything that brings a human being pleasure is going to contribute to happiness. And when we think about our actions, if we're doing what we can to promote pleasure, and we're doing that to promote pleasure for the greatest number of people, then we're doing the morally correct thing. That seems pretty straightforward, right? So it's not the case that there has to be one thing that you do that promotes pleasure for everybody. So giving everybody chocolate ice cream, or kinky sex, or sexy lingerie, right? Or Donald Trump Jr. in sexy lingerie. That one thing is not going to promote happiness for everyone, but there are certain actions that we can perform that are going to maximize pleasure. And according to Mill, pleasure just is happiness, right? So happiness and pleasure are pretty much identical. Well, they are identical. So happiness and pleasure, well, we're just going to say pleasure for the sake of simplicity. So whatever action is going to produce the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Now, there are some people who are not going to be pleased by a certain action. But if it pleases the most people generally, then that's going to be the correct thing to do. All right. So that seems like a pretty straightforward moral theory. It seems pretty simple. But here's another problem that you run into. How are you going to calculate this amount of pleasure? Pleasure is a subjective state, right? So it's a feeling that a person has. And it depends on who you are, whether or not you experience pleasure from a particular thing. So how in the world are we going to determine this? Well, that's difficult, right? Figuring out, what am I going to do? You kind of have to rely on a common sense sort of psychology, and you can think about it in terms of statistics. Well, people being able to pay their bills, that makes most people happy. It gives most people pleasure to have some financial security. So any time you're up against a decision that has this sort of general idea of pleasure involved, then that's going to be pretty straightforward. But you kind of have to use statistics, so you kind of have to know generally what's going to bring people pleasure. So right now, in contemporary society, during this plague, what is going to produce the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people? Well, how about social media right now seems to be doing a lot of that, right? So engaging in a very respectful and positive way on social media seems to be producing some positive results for a great number of people. So you can get on Twitter or you can get on Instagram, and there are a lot of artists who are sharing their work. The Metropolitan Opera is live casting, well, not live casting, but it's streaming operas for free. Right, so there are a lot of places where you can get operas, Broadway musicals that are suddenly available that weren't available before, right? So putting artwork out there into the world for people's enjoyment during this time of being cooped up in tiny spaces alone, that's producing a great deal of pleasure, right? So that's kind of an example of what would be a moral responsibility if you're going to be a utilitarian, right? So it's not just that it's morally permissible to do that, you kind of have a moral obligation to do that. So utilitarianism is a little bit demanding. It says, look, if there's something that you can do that's going to produce a great amount of good, you have a moral obligation to do that thing. Right? So you have a moral obligation to produce work during this time. For instance, if you have creative talent and the skill set, and you can produce something that'll cheer people up, then you have a moral obligation to do that. Right? So that's what the utilitarian is going to say. All right. So this looks like a pretty good deal, right? Pretty straightforward, pretty easy, pretty easy to understand. But what could possibly be wrong with a theory like this? What could possibly be wrong with this? Now let's really think about it. So we're supposed to create positive things in the world. We're supposed to do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. When we're looking at something like producing online content for people who are cooped up in their homes, that seems pretty intuitive, right? That we do have a moral obligation to do our best and to not hoard toilet paper so more people can have their toilet paper, to not buy so much food that other people can't access it, especially people who are on food stamps or people who are on WIC, right? So there's a limited number of options for them in the grocery store, and if hoarders go in there and they take all those options, people who have food stamps aren't going to be able to get their food, right? So, you know, it seems like this is a pretty straightforward thing, but what about this? What about if what's going to bring about world peace, and I know we talked about this once in class, you'll probably remember, but what if the thing that'll bring about world peace, now think about this, world peace, no hunger, no strife, no fascism, no racism, no misogyny, no transphobia, no homophobia, on and on and on, right? We're talking like utopia. If what's going to bring about utopia is torturing a child, one child gets tortured until they die, and then another child gets tortured until they die, but there's always, at any moment, a child being tortured. Is that morally obligatory according to utilitarianism? The answer is yes. So utilitarianism is going to come up with these really interesting results where you have to calculate the amount of benefit, and sometimes that's going to require you to do things that just intuitively seem like the wrong thing to do. Torturing a child, an innocent person who has done absolutely nothing, who's just randomly selected, right? This is starting to sound like a very dystopian Hollywood movie, right? There are plenty of movies out there that have this sort of theme to them. But if what's required for world peace is the torture of a child, some of us are going to say that seems like the wrong kind of moral result. This theory is throwing out these kind of wrong results. So this is a challenge for anybody who's going to have a consequentialist theory. This is not just a problem for utilitarianism, right? So remember, utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory because it cares about the consequences of an action in terms of whether to be able to decide, if we're going to decide whether or not an action was right or wrong, we have to assess the consequences, right? So that's just generally consequentialism. Utilitarianism defines benefit in terms of pleasure. So again, though, any utilitarian, but any consequentialist theory is going to suffer from the same objection, right? It seems to license, consequentialisms of all kinds, seem to license doing things that we would ordinarily think of or that we just intuitively think of as morally wrong in order to promote the greatest good, right? So that's something that if you're going to have a consequentialist theory, you're going to have to try to solve that problem. I think that there are ways to do it, but I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for Mill or a utilitarian, just a basic utilitarian, to solve this problem because the only thing that's good is pleasure. Now, if you think that there are other things that are good, like desire, satisfaction, like just not, you don't have to say that pleasure isn't good, but you're going to have to adjust your theory so that there are other things that are good. And it might not be the case that what is good is just individual goods, but there might also be societal goods that you have to think about and that you have to promote. So a sophisticated consequentialist theory, something that's much more sophisticated than your basic utilitarianism, is going to have a completely different set of ideas about what good consists in, right? So it might be pleasure, but it also might be desire satisfaction. It might be social cohesion. It might be, some kind of social order that is just, right? So you can have a whole lot of different things that you think are good and that you're obligated to promote and be a consequentialist and sort of address these problems like the torturing of children for the greater good, right? So, but then you're going to get a really complicated, really sophisticated consequentialism, and the simplicity of consequentialism, the simplicity of utilitarianism is really nice because it's good to have a moral theory that the average person can apply to their daily life, right? And if all you have to do is just sort of look at the consequences, sort of predict the consequences a little bit and say, well, this is going to be the best thing for everybody, that seems like a pretty straightforward, simple moral theory. But we also want a moral theory that gets the right answers. And if you want the right answers, you're going to have to get a lot more sophisticated. So that's chapter 6. Chapter 7 is an attempt to sort of address these questions, like what about these problems with your basic utilitarianism? What do we do to try to accommodate this issue? How do we fix this so that we're not torturing children for world peace, right? Or we're not obligated in some sense to torture children for world peace. So chapter 7 is where we get into what's called rule utilitarianism, right? So it's still utilitarianism. It's still going to define good in terms of pleasure, but it's the utilitarian's attempt to address these problems. So what do we do here? Well, we focus on something a little bit different. We focus on rules, right? So if you look at chapter 7, page 136, we've got two principles. We've got the principle of rules and the principle of acts. The principle of rules states this: a morally right rule or practice is one that would promote significantly greater overall utility, good, pleasure, if widely followed, than if it did not exist, right? So the idea here is that there are just these basic moral rules, like lying is a bad thing to do, shouldn't lie, or you shouldn't torture children, even for world peace, right? So you can have a rule: no torturing innocent people for world peace. You can have these rules, and then when you're decision making, you're applying rules rather than doing a calculus of benefits and harms, right? So all you have to do is still retain some simplicity, but then you've got rules that you have to learn. Okay, so what justifies the rules that we apply are that they produce, generally speaking, they're going to produce more pleasure than harm. Okay, so that's what justifies the rules that we have. So then the way that we assess the rightness or wrongness of an action is not directly by the consequences, because what justifies the rule is the consequences. So the way that we assess an action, any particular action, for its rightness or wrongness, is whether or not it obeys a rule. So that's where we have the principle of acts. The principle of acts says this: a morally right act is one that follows a morally right rule or practice. Rules identified as morally right by the principle of rules, right? So they're justified by the fact that they bring about the best consequences, generally speaking, should be followed except when they come into direct conflict with one another, right? So you could have rules that conflict with one another. And there are some examples in the book. I'm trying to remember what page they were on. So when we get into the dilemma principle on page 140, this is where they're starting to address this issue of what if you've got conflict between rules? How do you determine, how do you adjudicate between two rules? What if you've got two that seeming equally good rules that are going to give you different results? So the dilemma principle is just this: when circumstances place two or more rules in conflict, the morally right act for those circumstances is the act that will produce the greatest overall utility. So you're going to switch then back to act utilitarianism. So anytime you have a dilemma between the rules, you're going to break the tie, right? Which one should I apply? Well, they're conflicting. I'm just going to look then at my action, and I'm going to have to go back to calculating, right? Like I would with just a strict utilitarianism. Now, this actually seems like a simple way to address some of the issues with utilitarianism, because you can have rules, like I said, that forbid actions like torturing children, right? But here is the problem with rule utilitarianism, is that it often is going to just, it is, how can I put this? It collapses, theoretically, it collapses into act utilitarianism. First of all, under conditions where there's a conflict, you have to rely back on act utilitarianism, which could still give rise to some of these counterintuitive issues that we've identified in the previous chapter, right? Torturing children, for instance. Another problem that's going to that could potentially arise, that's going to cause, theoretically, rule utilitarianism to collapse back into act utilitarianism is this. Suppose that you've got a set of conditions. So you have to think about a scenario where you've got a lot of descriptive claims, right? So here's a general rule. it's wrong to kill. We shouldn't kill. Okay. Well, are there circumstances under which that's allowable, right? So all you have to do is you have to think about circumstances under which you might think it's okay to kill. Well, what are those circumstances? Think about it. Well, one that usually comes up really quickly is self-defense. Seems like you're justified, morally justified, in killing someone if they're trying to kill you, right? To save your life, or to save the life of a loved one, or to save the life of a child that somebody wants to torture for world peace. Okay, so that seems like a good set of circumstances under which that rule doesn't apply. So we have this exception. So now our rule is it's morally wrong to kill except under conditions of self-defense. Okay, so we have a modified rule. Okay, good. Now, how useful is that rule? Well, what about abortion? Now, assuming that abortion involves the killing, it does involve killing. It involves the killing of a fetus. Now, whether or not a fetus is a human, a person, not a human, it is human. But whether or not it is a person is, what's up for debate. But even let's just assume for the sake of argument that a fetus is, in some sense, a person, right? Is it wrong to kill? Well, you might think that there are reasons why it would be okay to terminate a pregnancy. For instance, if that pregnancy arose from rape or incest. You might also think that if the mother's life is in jeopardy, that this is like a self-defense sort of situation, or if the fetus itself is non-viable outside the womb and the mother's life is in jeopardy, that seems like a no-brainer, right? So now we have other exemptions to this rule. So we've got don't kill, right? We should not kill, except under conditions of self-defense, and except when here are these conditions. A woman gets pregnant and blah, 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 blah. All right, so now we have a very refined rule. Are there other circumstances under which it might be okay to kill? Well, what about just war? If you can't lump just war under self-defense, which you often can't, right, then you might think, well, there are certain times where we're justified in going to war, and that results in death, right? So now we've got this rule with lots and lots and lots of exceptions. And the more you fine-tune the rule, the more you're looking at an action in a scenario. So if you remember when we were doing moral decision-making, I think it was in chapter 4 or 5, somewhere around in there, we were crafting scenarios where we had a bunch of descriptive facts. Well, if you get enough descriptive facts, and you have to apply a rule that gives you everything you need in that situation, you're going to end up with a very fine-tuned rule that applies to only one situation. In that sense, you're basically involved in act consequentialism or act utilitarianism, because now what you're doing is you're looking at a very particular act in a very particular set of circumstances. So if you refine the rules enough to apply to a broad range of circumstances, you're going to end up with one act in one set of circumstances that's relevant, and that's act utilitarianism. So you're going to probably not. So it's weird because rule utilitarianism is supposed to be solving some of the problems of act utilitarianism, but ultimately when you start to apply it, it breaks down. So rule utilitarianism might work in sort of these broad strokes, but it doesn't seem to work at the really fine-tuned level. At that level, you're really not doing rule utilitarianism, because you're not just performing according to some moral rule. You're actually calculating consequences and sort of figuring everything out, and that's act utilitarianism. So that's a major problem with rule utilitarianism, though I think in the broad strokes it does tend to work. But I also think that this is just a problem with utilitarianism in general, right? So anytime you're talking about just promoting pleasure, and you're trying to look at, well, whether or not a particular act produces pleasure, or whether a particular rule produces the most amount of pleasure, I think that you can get complicated. You can get more complicated in that way, where you're trying to define rules and really fine-tune your rules, or you can fine-tune your notion of good. And I think that I think that that's the much more viable option, and a lot of people think that's a much more viable option. So the textbook doesn't really get into these other alternatives, but we have talked a little bit about this in class, where you might think that there are lots of other kinds of good that you can promote, rather than just pleasure, right? So there are a lot of things that contribute to human well-being other than pleasure, and those are the things that matter if you're going to be a consequentialist. So what I want you to get out of these two chapters is basically what I have just given you. Now, we're not going to be quizzed or tested on this, but what's important is that you remember these features, because now that we move into deontology, you're going to have to see how deontology differs. What kind of perspective a deontologist is going to bring that a utilitarian doesn't, right? So you need to be able to distinguish between these views pretty much just in the broad strokes. That's all I really care about at this point. So make sure that you understand this is how utilitarianism works, and utilitarianism is just one example of a consequentialist theory. And be prepared then to think about the differences between that kind of theory and the deontological theory of Kant that we're going to get into in Chapter 8. So I will be putting together another video in a day or two about Kant's deontology. Now, Kant, Abdi, here's your time to shine, sweetie, because I know you love Kant. All right. So Kant's theory is a little bit complicated. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of a lecture. I hope this isn't lecture-y. I want it to be more like a discussion, and I'm sorry that you're not here to discuss with me and that we can't use the classroom technology because my iPad is too old. But hopefully this will be more like a discussion rather than a lecture. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Kant, give you some interesting facts about him personally. Ooh, I'm going to spill a little bit of tea about Kant. Except Abdi has pretty much spilled a lot of tea about Kant over the semester already, so I think you probably already have a pretty good idea of what this guy's like. But it'll be really interesting to go through his theory and think about it in terms of the psychology. So Kant really was interested in human psychology and how the human mind works. And so his theory is going to be focused a lot more on the mental states that are involved in moral decision-making and how we assess the rightness or wrongness of an action based on the kind of mental states that are going on inside a person's head. And you're going to see how that's a little bit different, well, in some ways a lot different. It's going to get different results than a consequentialist theory like utilitarianism. So I will be posting more information for you soon. I want you guys, before the end of the week, I'm going to post the questions for you to sort of think about for Chapter 8. For you and your discussion groups to sort of explore a little bit. I'm probably going to bring in some real-world examples to this too for your discussion groups. I will put the quiz. I will make it live. The quiz will be available for you over the weekend, so I will give you a couple days to get that done. But really, what I'm really interested in at this point is that you just understand the broad strokes and that you have a productive discussion with your teammates. And I will be perusing the discussion boards to make sure that y'all are getting into your discussions. So if I don't see a whole lot of discussion going on, I'm going to start poking you with a big stick. I have a big stick. Actually, I have a saber. I'm going to poke you with my big stick. Okay, so I hope you all are doing well. If any of you are having difficulty right now, emotionally, psychologically, whatever, you're not alone. Email me. Contact me in some way. I'm happy to talk to you about any of the issues that you're experiencing with trying to get through the rest of this semester. So don't suffer in silence. Don't suffer alone. Let me know if you need some help because I'm here for you. I really am. I know I've been a little bit, silent the last couple days, but the ER will do that to you. Anyway, love you guys. Miss you so much. I'll be posting more videos soon. Maybe I'll do some funny content for you. We'll see. I'll try.